Great. Right, thank you everyone for joining us today on this webinar. As Sarah says, the topic today is replacing your apps which are using SharePoint 2010 workflows with QuizCom forms. Now, I'll have a few slides just to set the scene and explain each of the demos I'm going to go through, but the majority of the session will be demos. As Sarah said, feel free to ask questions as you go along and we'll answer them at the end of the webinar. So those of you who don't know, Microsoft are retiring SharePoint 2010 workflows from Office 365. Now you might think, well, that's not important. SharePoint 2010, that's a long time ago. But actually, it's still commonly used within Office 365 for a number of different uses. Often people turn to it, and I've used it myself over the last few years, because some of the things you can do with SharePoint 2010 workflows are very simple, and achieving the same thing either using a SharePoint 2013 workflow or Power Automate is either just too complicated, might involve calling, REST APIs and other things like that. So some of the examples which you may turn to SharePoint 2010 workflows, there's sort of out-of-the-box actions for doing simple approvals. You can build an approval process in, a minute or two, which might take longer in the other tool sets. Permission management. There's not an easy way to do permission management within 2013 workflows. And there is now some actions finally available within Power Automate, but my personal experience is the permission actions are somewhat unreliable in setting the permissions required. And finally, things like task creation, simply creating tasks, assigning tasks for people to do. Sure, you can do that with 2013 workflows or Power Automate, but again, the level of complexity to build something like that, build the response to someone's action to go and update, a document or an item to say that they've been approved or reviewed or rejected or whatever it might be. It's just unnecessarily complicated. So what options have you got with SharePoint 2010 workflows being retired? Now, obviously, you can look to tools like 2013 workflows, Power Automate. Maybe if you've got deep development resources or strong technical resources available to you, or you can call on a third party to do that. But if your skill sets are more limited and you haven't got a lot of budget to rework those workflows, then this is what QuizCom Forms can offer, as well as a number of other things. Now we're going to be focusing on the workflow components today, but it's worth saying that these components, which I'm going to show you, are part of the QuizCom Forms app. So if you've seen any of the other webinars I've done or had a chance to look at the QuizCom website, you'll see that QuizCom Forms allows you to build out these rich forms, leveraging Microsoft's new modern Fluent UI, although there is a classic version of it available as well for those of you still using classic SharePoint. And you can build out, really rich forms with interdependent lookups, default values, locking, hiding sections of the form, lay it out in a neat way, even with repeating rows of interrelated data as well. And I'll show you a couple of examples of those briefly during the course of the demo. But my main focus today is on actions and activities, which are a part of QuizCom Forms. And these two things are, firstly, activities. These are reusable actions which you can then use more than one time within an action, which I'll come to a second. So for example, send an email, add an item to a list, set permissions, call a web service, and you can define and use columns from your list, tokens such as current user or today, and also set variables which you can then configure dynamically when you're building out a custom action. So a custom action is like a workflow, a use case, using a number of conditions and also running one or more activities. So it might be create an item in this list, and then if this happens under this condition, send an email, for example. So as I said, I'm going to go straight into the demo, and what I'll try and do is I'll explain each demo briefly with a slide before I do it. I'll show you it in action, and then I'll take the stuff away, which I've built already, and then I'll show you how those are built up as well. So the first one, I wanted to keep it fairly simple to start with, just to introduce you with some of the topics, which was taking the example of a document, being uploaded to a library, setting permissions on that document to someone, and sending an email. Now this will be a quite simple example, and we'll build up some more complicated scenarios as we go through the other two demos I've got for you today. So let's move over to SharePoint, and firstly I'll show you just this piece working. So I've got a document library here called Project Documents. I'm going to use a couple of users today, so I'm going to use firstly a user called Joe. He's going to be my user, which I'm using to just fill out things, upload information, and I'll use another user in a second, which will receive actions to do. So I come here and I upload a file, nothing unusual there, and I'll go and select my file, and I'll upload it to my document library. Okay. Now what that's done is a couple of things. Firstly, if I switch over to another user, and you will see that Peter has also received an email telling him that he's got to review a document at a specific link. So I've sent Peter an email, and I've also set his permissions on that document library to be that he has access to that document. So I could do all sorts of things. I could set permissions based on a specific user, like I've done here. I could base it on a group of users. Entirely up for me to configure, but you see there I've put Peter there and given him access. So how do we do this? How do we configure this so that Peter can be notified and be given access to that document library? Well, we do that using KWIZ Forms. And you see I've got KWIZ Forms available and configured here. So if I click on the link, now there's a number of different settings which I'm not going to go into in any detail today, such as managing the layout of my form, or interdependent fields and other things like that, which which we've recorded and been through in other webinars. But what I'll do is I'm going to move down and look at these two areas which I talked about. So firstly, the activities which are available for me to configure, and the different steps such as setting permissions and sending an email. And then I'll show you how we group them together into a process called actions. Once this loads up, give it a second. There we go. So you see I've got a couple of activities already set up here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete them, and I'm going to recreate them because I want to show you how I've done this. So I'm going to walk you through the different steps which I've configured here. We've removed my activities which we've got set up, so now we'll go and create the two activities again. So the first activity which I'm going to do is I'm going to send an email to Peter. So when I come in and I define a new activity, I set what am I going to configure. So I'm going to configure an email, and we'll give it a name. This is just a name which when we actually start to use it, we can look up. So let's say send an email. And then this is where we actually get to defining the properties of what we're going to do. So we can say, well, who's it going to be sent to? So I'm just going to set the email address. Now we can use things like dynamic properties here, variables, and we'll go into those in a little bit more detail as we go through the demo. So what's my subject? I'm going to say review. And then it's great here because it's giving me little guides. So I can either reference a column within my list, I can reference system tokens like me or today, or I can create a variable which sort of parameterizes it. So if I was using my email activity multiple times in a process for this list, then I can use that parameter to reference different things into the subject. So I'm going to do that in this instance so you can see how it works. And we do that by just putting it in brackets and just giving that variable a name. So I'm going to call that document for simplicity. And then I can then say, please, can you review this document? And I could build this out. I could put a link to the document or to the document library. I can neatly format this email. You see I've got various rich formatting options here available to me. But we'll keep it fairly simple for now. So we'll just save that activity. And now we're going to go and create another one. And in this case, we're going to create the one to set permissions. So this time setting a different activity type. And you see we've got a range of ones like add item, copy item, get user group membership, which is quite useful if you want to sort of get all the members of the groups and send them emails, for example, or do something else with them. I'm going to do set item permissions. And I'm going to give this activity a name. So I'm going to call that, let's call it something like set permissions for simplicity. Set permission to document. And then look how you get some interesting options here on the property. So I can either update the current item, which is what I'm going to do, but I could go and look up items in other lists, even within different sites within my environment. In this case, I'm going to stick to that. I can decide whether I want to remove existing permissions. Let's do that. And then I can say, well, what permission level do I want to give it? Do I want to give it contribute? Let's give them full control. And then I can say, well, who do I want to add here? Again, notice I can use various variables or column values. So for instance, if I had my column if I had like a person field as one of the columns in my library or list, then I could set that property automatically. I'm going to keep it fairly simple and just set Peter directly as a user. Okay, so that's configured my two activities. Now what I want to do is I want to set my custom action. So let's go back to form settings and then to actions. And you'll see here that I've got let's remove my existing action and we'll configure a new one. So this is my actual workflow process which I'm defining. And we can define a couple of different actions here. So we can either have an automatic one, which occurs when something happens. So for example, an item is added to a list or library, or it's updated, or even it's deleted, which is quite useful. Or you can add ribbon button actions. So quite useful in KWIZ Forms scenarios where you've got a form and you want someone to sort of manually initiate something by clicking on a button. In my case, I'm going to do add, do it automatically. So I'm going to say review document is the name of my action. Send email and set permission. And then I can define when it happens. So I'm going to only do it when a document is added, in my case. Note I can define a condition under which that document, action runs using various columns from my list. And then I can add various activities, again with conditions. So it might be if a document meets a certain condition, then do that activity. So I've got a range, I can define when the action should run and then when certain activities can run. So firstly, I'm going to choose to send an email. So these are my activities I configured in the previous step. So in this case, I'm sending an email to Peter, and I've got my variable I've defined here. So let me configure that. And I can use at this point the ability to map in various properties from the item itself. So in this case, I'll just take the name of the document. In an example with a more complex list, you'd have a range of fields available here. And then maybe let's add my other activity in, which in this case is to set the permissions on the document. So pretty simple, building up a couple of activities with defined rules and then defining the steps which I want it to follow. Okay? And then I just save that, and that's it. You know, I talked a little bit slowly so you could see the process going through, but it's a pretty simple process to go and set those activities up and those actions. You know, you could do that in a couple of minutes. So that's how I built out my first example. Now let's go back and look at a second example. So any of you who saw my previous webinar around QuizCon Forms, we looked at building out an expenses form. And this is then using and extending that process with actions and activities to manage a simple approval process. What it will do is it will define who the approver is by going and looking that up against a list, and it will also then involve locking and hiding certain sections of the form to do with approval until that it reaches that approval state. We'll also have a few emails being sent as well. So let me show you how that works. Firstly, let's just switch back to being as Joe. And I'll go and submit a new expenses request. So those of you who haven't seen it, this will be a good example of just taking a regular SharePoint list and customizing it very quickly and easily with QuizCon Forms. I'm not going to go into that in any detail today, but I'll just call out a couple of examples as I go through that. So I can set the date of my expense. So I've got like simple date controls. I've got lookup columns, and I'll show you in a second how that's actually looking up from a separate site. Notice how some of these fields like submitter, status, approval are locked. So I'm using other elements of QuizCon Forms to lock those fields based on certain states of the form. And then I can come in here and set various expenses which I want to claim. So let's say I took a flight. It was $200 and I stayed in a hotel and that was $150. And I had dinner. And that was $50. So adding additional rows and lines using the repeating rows capability of QuizCon Forms. I'm going to save this request. And what this is going to do is, using an action, it's then going to send me an email, or send Peter an email based on what department I've selected there. So switching back to Peter for a second, I want to show you another site. So I'm just going to go to a different SharePoint site, and in this SharePoint site, I've got a list called departments. And you can see in that list, I've got my 3 departments, and I set a field against them in terms of who the approver is. So using KWIZ Forms, I'm going to that list, looking up the department, and that could be a user, it could be a group, and setting my email to send, and some other ongoing actions based on that. Again, you see that Peter has received an email. He'll even receive a link to that expenses form. And if we click on that link, that specific request will open. And you'll notice the nature of the form has slightly changed. We can see that Peter has now been set as the approver. And if I come in and edit this item now, do you see that I get options now to change the status and add some comments, which I previously didn't have available to me when I was just a user doing the request. So how have we done that? Well, we've done that through a series of activities, an action, and also some other settings within KWIZ Forms. And I'll just briefly touch on all of those so you can see them. Okay, so firstly, my activities. I've got 4 activities here, which I've defined. The first one is the get approver. So in this scenario, instead of manually setting it, I'm getting the approver from that separate departments list. So I'm choosing the get column value action. And then in this case, rather than getting something from my current list, I'm getting it from another list. I'm defining that as being a separate site from what I'm in at the moment. I'm choosing a specific list, in this case department, and then where the field from that list, in this case the title, equals the department from my expenses list. So referencing any columns within my list using those square brackets. And finally, what column am I retrieving from my departments list? I'm retrieving the approver. So that's getting my approver. Next, I want to set that approver. So I need to set that approver. Now, I could just send emails, but actually I want to store that value within my list, within my expenses request item. So to do that, I'm doing the update item. And then I'm updating an item in the current list. I'm updating the approver field. And in this case, I'm just going to define and set a variable. And I'll configure how that variable is used in the action itself. Next, I'm just doing two simple approval actions. So the first one is to send an email, so an activity to send an email. And in this case, again, I'm using a few properties. So I'm using and setting the approver as a variable, which again, I'll set within my action. And I'm configuring the link to my form. In this case, using a property from my list, the ID. And I'm also including the value of the submitter from my list. So referencing those, using those squared brackets as defined in the help menu. So very simple to do. Finally, I'm creating another activity to do with the outcome of the expense. So I'm actually going to have two processes. When someone's approved or rejected the expense, then this will then run a second action to send a separate email. And I'll show you this all being configured in a second. And in this case, again, I'm just using a variety of columns from my list to configure this activity. So the submitter, status, approver, and approval comments. So making that email dynamic. I could, if I wanted to, have two separate activities. If I wanted to have completely different text for, approved versus rejected. So I've got some options in terms of how I can configure things. Okay, let's look at how then those are configured in the action itself, or in my case, I've actually configured two actions. So the first one is the more complex one, which is the actual approval process itself. Again, it's an automatic action. And I've got three activities configured. So the first one is getting the approver. And note I've got an output coming out of this. So I've got, it saves the output as output 1. Next, I'm setting the approver using that set approval activity. And in here, I'm able to use the output of the previous activity to set who the approver is on my list. And I do exactly the same when I send the email. So setting my variable to be that output of the first activity. So that goes and queries the list based on my department, gets me the approver, and then sets that field against the list and sends the email. So all dynamic. And if we had multiple different fields we were setting, we could use these reusable activities multiple times. Secondly, I've got another action which runs when the item is updated. So when someone comes in and actions the approval, this will then just send the email to the submitter telling them of the outcome. So pretty simple and just built up from these series of activities into two different actions. There's a few other bits which I use within KWIZ Forms just to make this process a little bit slicker. So for example, I'm using the default values within KWIZ Forms to set the default value of my submitter, for example, to always be me, so that it defaults to me. I set the claim date as today, I set the default status to be submitted. So just some simple field default values to make the process run smoothly. I'm then also using the ability to show, hide, or lock fields to control states of certain fields during the approval process. really works quite nicely for simple approval processes where maybe creating separate tasks, which I will show you in a second, is not necessarily required. So in this instance, I, for instance, disabled the approver field. We don't want people manually setting that, so that's controlled entirely by my custom action. Equally, the submitter, that's controlled by my default value, so I don't need to do that either. And then both the status and the approval comment are hidden under different states. So they're hidden in the initial add form. And even being able to disable that based on specific users or groups of users, so that the regular users can't interact with that field, or if it's even if the form is in certain states as well. So lots of opportunities to configure that and make the process as seamless as possible. So that's how we've built out, and I've built out a simple HR approval process, in this case connecting to a separate list for a lookup. So let's look at one last example today, which is an approval process leveraging tasks. So this is actually going and creating tasks in a separate list rather than just using fields within my form. And again, using approval via a lookup. Now, for simplicity today, I'm looking up to a separate list, but we can also go and query other data sources. So, for example, I could go and look at the SharePoint profile service and look up someone's manager, for example. So if you're interested in that scenario, do reach out and we can walk through how that one will work for you. Okay, so let's go and show you this one in action first of all. So back in as Joe, and I will come in and do a request. In this case, I'm doing a CapEx form. So another thing which I've commonly built in SharePoint over the years, fairly simple form with some approval processes associated with it. So I'm going to go and put in a new request. And let's say we need some new mobile phones. And I'll select the department. And I'll set the budget. Now you could do all sorts of quite smart things here, like based on the value set in the budget, you could have different approval paths being followed, for example. I've kept it pretty simple in my scenario. So switching back to Peter as the approver, in this case, as well as emails, I'm actually creating a task for Peter to do. And we'll see that if I go to CapEx approval. So I've got a separate task list which I've created, and this will then initiate and create a number of tasks for Peter to do. It's just creating my task, but you can see them coming through here. So I'll just look at one which I've already done. And you can see a few things which I'm storing. I'm storing the title. I'm storing who the approver is, so I go and look that up again from either a separate list or from a from something like the profile service. And then I've got the ability to come in and edit that item and set the request, set the outcome. Now, importantly, in this task list, there it comes through. I'm also storing the ID. So I'm storing the ID from my list item. So in this case, it was item 10. And I need this because I actually have activities and actions running on both lists. So I'm going and having one action on my CapEx request list to go and create my task, and then I've got another action, an activity on my approval list to go back and set the target list. Now I could do that based on title, but it's a bit imprecise. So I'm using my ID to come and set that status. So let me just come here and approve the item so we can see the end of the journey, and then we'll look at how we built some of those up, and we'll go through part of this as an actual example together, building that up. So again, I'm just using KWIZ Forms here to control my approval tasks. I might want to configure it, tailor it to a specific need, so I can do that really simple. Okay, so that's been approved, and now a separate action will run on this list as I describe, and we'll go back to my CapEx request list. And we'll set that item as approved. Yeah. So let's just have a look at the setup in KWIZ Forms for these. So we've started off on the CapEx request list. And if we go in and have a look at our activities, I've got three activities. Now the first two are the same as I've shown you before, getting the approver and setting the approver. That could be from a list, the user profile service as well. The last one is actually to create the approval task. So I'm actually going to remove this because I actually want to go through and show you briefly this being created and how we go and create this specific activity. So let's go in and create that. And in this case, I'm going to choose to add an item. So I want to go and create something in my list. So I'm going to go, let's call it create task. And then in here, I define what it is. So no, I could do it in a separate site, but I'm just going to use my CapEx approval list in the current site. And then I'm going to add a number of fields which I want to go and set in that list. So I want to set the title, and I'm going to use a number of variables here so I can configure it within my action. So firstly, I'm going to use one called title. And then I'm going to use one for approver. And then finally, I'm going to use one to set my CapEx ID. Actually, let's just call it ID for simplicity, because that's actually what the value is. Now, I could just look up all those fields from the list, but I like to show you using variables just because I like to show you the full capability of the tool set. So that's setting up my activity. And we could build this up and have emails and other things going on if we wanted to. Let's go and look at the configuration of my action then. So I've just got one action on my request list to start the approval process. And I've got a series of activities. So I'm getting the approver, setting the approver, and then finally I'm going to create the approval task. And I can set my various outputs. So I can say that the title is just going to take from the title of my list. The approver is going to be the output from up here when I go and get the approver. And then finally, I'm going to set the ID of my list to set all of those properties in the item which I create. Now I'm going to save that, and then next I'll show you the activity and action on the other side. So within the task list itself, I'll show you the configuration there. So to do that, we'll just come back and go to my CapEx approval list. And in here, I've got activity, which is for updating the CapEx. So I'm going to go and update my CapEx request list with the outcome. Again, I'll just show you it being configured. So let's just see and configure that. And what we're going to do is we're going to go and update an item, and I'm going to call that update CapEx. And again, I'm going to go and update a different item within the current site, and I'm going to select my CapEx request list. And this is where storing that ID is so important. So I'm storing and selecting which item from my CapEx request list to go and update. So in this case, I'm selecting the ID, and I'm using that CapEx ID field, which I set as part of my previous action and activities on the request list itself. And in this case, I'll then go and set the approval field on my CapEx request and I could set a certain value, but actually what I want to do here is I want to use a variable again, because I'm going to set that dynamically within my action. So let's just save that. And then finally, we're going to go over to my action and show you how to configure that, including setting just that dynamic variable based on the outcome. So I've got an action which runs, which is just called approval outcome. And in here, it's again an automatic action. And I'll add my activity to update the CapEx. And all I need to do is set the outcome based on the outcome which the user sets. So on the task, if they say approved or rejected, that will then go back and update my CapEx request based on that outcome set against the task. And it really is that simple. So just using several different activities and configuring them with an action, it will follow those processes with the request and the approval list. Okay. So just a quick summary, and then we'll have a chance for some questions. The first thing which is really key about anything KWIZ Forms is it's easy to set up by non-technical users. I haven't had to do any coding there. It's just using variables, a few properties. Nothing anyone who knows how to create an Excel formula wouldn't be able to do. I can do all sorts of things which SharePoint 2010 workflows can do, and we maybe rely on at the moment, such as setting permissions, sending emails, creating items in separate lists. I can create approval processes from either fixed values within my list, looking up to other lists, or looking up to other data sources like the user profile service. I can easily replace my existing workflow processes, my existing SharePoint 2010 workflow processes, without the complexity of the 2013 workflows, or without having to learn a new technology in Power Automate. And most importantly, this is all done in the browser. I don't need to have SharePoint Designer, or there's even a Power Automate desktop now. I don't need to install all of this. I can do this very simply, very easily within my browser. So with that, thank you. Appreciate your time today for the webinar, and open up for any questions.